Excellent. Well then, let's talk about the problem of normativity. That's today's topic. And so what I want to do is think about a problem that I think is a central problem throughout the 20th century. It is in part a philosophical problem, but it's not just a philosophical problem. It's really a problem that affects people's everyday lives, the way they think about their lives, the way they think about themselves, the way they think about their relationship to other people and to the world. So let's take a look at what this problem is. We have to go back to the Enlightenment. The problems that are dealt with in the 20th century arise out of the Enlightenment, and in particular in the scientific revolution. There are two thoughts that emerge in the Enlightenment that sit somewhat uncomfortably together. And Enlightenment thinkers, I think, don't fully appreciate the complexity of this. But by the dawn of the 20th century, people became well aware of the tension between these two Enlightenment ideals. One of them is the gap between is and ought. That's what I'm calling this problem of normativity. What do I mean by normativity? Well, norms, the ought factor. We evaluate the world as good, bad, right, wrong, just, and unjust. We also describe the world, and there's a little bit of a tension between those two things. In a traditional conception of the world, they go together very nicely. But there's something, as we'll see, about the scientific revolution that suggests, at least to some people, that science could be a complete description of the world. And once that's the case, you start thinking, well, wait, then what is left over for these evaluative judgments, the rights, wrongs, just, unjust, for that matter, virtuous, vicious, cowardly, courageous, and so on? What is there left for that kind of language to do? What's left for the ought, if we can give a complete description of the world in science in terms of just is and must? So there's a gap between is and ought, between description and prescription, if you want to put it that way, or description and evaluation, between fact and value. And it's that gap that is going to concern us. Now, the thought really goes back to ancient times that yes, there are these two dimensions of things. I can simply describe, or I can also evaluate. I can talk about the way the world is, or the way the world ought to be. However, the tension between the two is something that really arises as a product of the Enlightenment. The second thought from the Enlightenment that is going to create the puzzle and do a lot to create the tension is the idea of a two-level theory. We're going to see a lot of two-level theories throughout this course, and so they arise for the first time, perhaps, in the Enlightenment. They create a problem, as we'll see, about what it is to be human. Now, what do I mean by a two-level theory? Well, according to this sort of theory, there is a surface level of things, roughly the world as we observe it, and ourselves as we observe ourselves, and then there's a depth level, a deeper level that actually does all the explanatory work, that explains why things at the surface level behave the way they do. So a classic example is in science. We describe what's going on in a chemistry lab, for example, by talking ultimately about molecular structures. We talk about the microscopic level of things, and we say that explains what's going on at the macroscopic level, the level of appearances. That's one example of a two-level theory. As we'll see throughout the course, there are many others. There's evolutionary theory that says, aha, yes, you seem to be doing this and this, but really you're serving a certain genetic purpose. Or we'll see a variety of versions, for example, Freudian psychology. Ah, you think you're doing it for that reason, but no, you're really doing it because you hate your father and wanted to sleep with your mother and so on. Or Nietzsche's idea that, yes, you think you're doing this for noble reasons, but actually it's a will to power, you're doing it to grab additional power for yourselves, and so on and so forth. So there are going to be lots of examples of two-level theories we'll consider. The purest, you might say the most respectable, is the thing that arises out of the scientific revolution. The scientific conception of the world is ultimately depending on the behavior of microparticles. But we'll see many other variants. Anyway, what's key here is that what's happened hidden at this deep level determines what's happening at the surface level. Well, to see why these get into tension and why we have a problem reconciling fact and value, why we have a problem dealing with the two levels and their relation, we've got to go back to the scientific revolution and see what it does. It begins with the work of these scientists, Copernicus, Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, Galileo Galilei, and Isaac Newton, all of whom do fundamental things to structure our understanding of the world. As Galileo puts it, he unveils the fact that God has written the world in the language of mathematics, and mathematical laws can characterize the behavior of things in the world. So, the signal achievement, you might say, of the scientific revolution is really the development of a system of universal and necessary laws of nature. Universal because they apply across the board. It's not just that, hey, the distance something falls is 1/2 the gravitational constant times the square of the time here in Austin, but in Bulgaria, things just really fly around fast. No, right? These are universal. They apply all over the place. They are necessary. It's not like, yeah, there's an exception. My keys are really an exception. When I toss them in the air and come down, they violate Galileo's law, but they're special anti-Galilean keys. No, it's not like that. And so Galileo's law is something that applies universally, applies necessarily. The same thing for Newton's law. This one, if the sum of forces acting on an object is 0, then the acceleration of the object is 0. Or force is equal to mass times acceleration. Or the sum of the forces from A to B is just the negation of the forces from B to A, the one that's often expressed as every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Or the law of gravitation, one of Newton's great achievements. Gravitational force is the gravitational constant times the product of the masses of the object divided by the square of the radius, the distance between them. Those laws are things that apply universally, apply necessarily, and are the great achievements of the scientific revolution. It didn't take long for science to become institutionalized. By the 1640s, the British Royal Society began to meet. It was chartered in 1662. The French Royal Academy of Sciences began meeting in the 1650s and was chartered in 1666. There were observatories at Paris and Greenwich by 1675, and there's the Greenwich Observatory, hence Greenwich Mean Time, by which we still calculate time. Scientific journals first made their appearance in 1665. So it was just after the time of Newton, really during Newton's lifetime, that science became an institutional structure, and science as a body, socially, became something like what we would recognize today. Well, what sort of attitude did the scientific revolution prompt among other kinds of thinkers? Voltaire, for example, developed a skepticism about anything beyond the realm of science. He was a skeptic about religion, but also a skeptic about all sorts of other ideologies. And so his attitude was one recommending toleration. There were certain things that were knowable by the scientific method. We could discover, for example, the laws of motion, the laws of gravitation. However, other things were really outside the sphere of science. And there, he said, we're incapable of actually having knowledge. People just have opinions. But when it's a matter of opinion rather than knowledge, the most we should do, since we can't really settle that, is to tolerate each other's opinions. Well, we've seen some examples of things that he would place inside the sphere of knowledge. Things like the law of gravitation and the laws of motion. What are some things that might lie outside that? What sorts of things is he skeptical about? And here, skeptical just meaning there's no way to know the truth of any of these other things. What would be like that?
Opinions.
Religion.
Okay, religion is one. So yes, is there a God? Well, science presumably can't determine the answer to that. And so it will turn out that, yes, that's something where he says, look, in the end, we can't know. And so his conclusion is we should simply tolerate different opinions because they're just opinions. There's no way to settle this in scientific terms. There's no way to really know anything about this. So one of you mentioned opinions in general. What other kinds of opinions might we have no hope of settling by scientific means?
Moral boundaries.
Moral boundaries. Okay, somebody says premarital sex is wrong. Somebody else says, no, I think it's permissible. Somebody else says, I think it's wonderful. How do we settle the distinction among those views, right? We can describe things. On the other hand, if we're evaluating and saying whether this is right or wrong, you might think there's no way science can settle that. I mean, I don't encourage you to try taking a physics course and saying, before we get started, there's something that's really been bothering me about the world. Is premarital sex right or wrong? Physics isn't going to settle that question. And so there are lots of things that are going to be lying beyond the bounds of science. And so Voltaire says, look, there's no way to really know. The best we can do is tolerate alternative opinions. Now, it might be about sort of big things like the existence of God or the nature of morals, but it can also be about small things. What is the greatest football team in the history of civilization? The Texas Longhorns. The Texas Longhorns. Well, not recently. but we can have differing opinions about that, right? And in fact, every October there are very strongly differing opinions about this. You will see all sorts of, and hear all sorts of chants, OU sucks, okay? Does OU really suck? Yes. Well, this is actually, according to Voltaire, he didn't have any opinions about the Red River rivalry, I don't think, but if he did, he would say, look, there's no way to really determine scientifically whether OU sucks, and so the most we can do is tolerate different opinions. In any case,
It's a universal truth.
yeah, well, everyone thinks that. I mean, yeah, never mind. So, in fact, at one point, Thomas Hobbes says, listen, common sense, it must be plentifully distributed among people. How can you tell? Because everybody thinks they have enough of it. And so everybody tends to think their own opinions are right, and in fact, obviously right. Now, Denis Diderot, who edited the French Encyclopedia, which really tried to systematize knowledge, it was the first encyclopedia. It was an attempt to say, well, here's what we know. It was a sort of victory lap for the scientific revolution, and he took things further than Voltaire. He wasn't simply skeptical. He felt that the success of science proved materialism. And so he concluded, this world is only a mass of molecules. All there is are the microparticles that science describes. They are simply molecules. They are simply material stuff. Those molecules behave according to physical law. They interact in ways that science either has described or is in principle capable of describing. There is nothing left over. Well, what might be left over? What is he denying the existence of? God, for one thing, right? Voltaire is simply saying, look, there's no way to know. He's saying, actually, science gives us a complete description of the world. There's nothing else. Now, of course, science itself doesn't establish its own completeness. This is a claim made on behalf of science. But as we can see, it didn't take long. Roughly 100 years. Actually, that's less than 100 years after Newton. But by 100 years after Newton, people began to think, yeah, science isn't just describing one dimension of the world. It is describing the world. Full stop. There's nothing left over. And so people took the scientific revolution, not to prove that there is no God, but many of them thought, what more do you need? There's no need to go beyond this. In fact, in a famous episode, two people were disputing, talking about the nature of science, and at one point the king, who was listening to this disputation, said, I don't understand. I didn't hear you refer to God in your explanation. And he said, I have no need of that hypothesis. And so that was the point. Really, I don't need this, okay? I don't need religion. But of course, there are lots of other things you might think you don't need. If science gives you a complete description of the world, if the world is just a mass of molecules, what else is left out?
Thoughts.
Thoughts, aha. Yeah. Actually, I'm not sure whether you said thoughts or oughts,
No,
but they're both right. Okay? The oughts, right? All that stuff normative that I was talking about, the oughts, just, unjust, right, wrong, all that gets left out. But moreover, thoughts get left out. If I am really just a mass of molecules, then wait a minute, what about my thoughts? What about my feelings? What about my desires? What about everything about me that constitutes my mental life? Where is it in this picture? Once again, if you go into the physics class and say, I don't understand how desire fits into this picture. What is a desire in physics? The physicist really has no way of explaining that, right? It's just left out of the picture. So it isn't just God that's being left out of this, or just morality or something like that. It's unclear how we fit thought itself into the picture. And that means it's unclear how we fit ourselves into the picture. Baron d'Holbach goes even further. He says, really? Well, you might say he draws the conclusion. He says, yes, Diderot is right. The world merely consists of material particles. It is just a material thing. And so he draws explicitly the conclusion. So there is no God. So morality doesn't make any sense. So we are not, in fact, the beings we think we are. We think we're free agents, acting on the basis of reasons. We're merely beings driven robotically by physical law. It's just that somehow we're unaware of our robotic status. Now, that is a common Enlightenment view. It is by no means the universal reaction to the scientific revolution. Another group of thinkers says, wait a minute, I can take the methods of the scientific revolution and apply them to morality, and apply them to politics. So I don't have to give up. I don't have to say all of this is nonsense. In fact, there's a conception of rationality that emerges from the scientific revolution, and I can use that idea of rationality to give shape to morality and to give shape to politics. And so there are a number of classical Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke, for example, or Immanuel Kant, who take this as a brief for liberty. They take it as a brief for respect for individual rights. And they basically think, here's what I can do to make sense of these oughts. I can think in terms of rationality. What is it rational for me to do? What is it rational for us to do together? So Locke, for example, justifies the legitimacy of government by saying a government is legitimate when it is rational for people to submit themselves to its authority. And Kant will say morality ultimately comes down to the same thing. We obey certain moral laws and we impose them on ourselves, ultimately because it's the rational thing to do. So it is not as if everyone tends in this atheistic direction and in this anti-normative direction. These thinkers don't. They remain religious and they take the conception of rationality that emerges from the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution as something they can apply to the normative sphere. Nevertheless, there's a sense in which they too are skeptics. Locke and Kant were both Protestants, and so they didn't have a great deal of respect for religious authority as such, and they believed in tolerance for different viewpoints. And so they didn't think morality and religion went away completely, but nevertheless within those spheres they thought it was important to be tolerant of alternative views. Some things maybe could be known, other things had to be left to individual judgment. All of the Enlightenment thinkers, nevertheless, hold to four basic principles, and these are going to recur throughout the course. We'll see them challenged throughout the 20th century in various ways and by various figures. The first of these theses of the Enlightenment is one I'm just labeling the thesis of truth. There are truths that are absolute. They are independent of any individual mind, and thus they apply universally. So these truths are absolute, independent of individual minds, they are universal. Here is the title page of Galileo's Dialogue on Two World Systems, where he has two people debating basically the structure of the solar system. And he sees it as ultimately a question of, well, as figuring out what is the truth. Does the Earth revolve around the sun? Does the sun revolve around the Earth? And there's a debate in this. They're trying to find some truth that both sides would agree, if you can find it, is absolute, is independent of your mind or my mind, and applies universally. What are some examples, besides scientific laws, which were taken as the paradigm of these sorts of truths? The law of gravitation, the laws of motion, these were thought to be things that are absolute, universal, independent of any individual mind. Can you think of other things that might have that status? Things that would actually be true, absolutely, and independently of what you or I think about them? Yeah?
Is one of them, I think, therefore I am?
Ooh, good. Descartes comes up with that one in the 17th century. I think, therefore I am. Indeed, he says, look, there are certain things I can doubt. In fact, he thinks I can doubt almost everything. Right now, it seems to me that I'm speaking to a classroom full of people. But Descartes said, I could be wrong about that. Maybe I'm really asleep and dreaming all of this. You know, maybe I conked out in my office and I'm guilty. We'll find out about this with Freud later. And so I wish I were in class, and so I dream that I'm in class lecturing even though I'm not. Or maybe there's an elaborate illusion. Maybe you're not a group of students. Maybe you're all robots. Or maybe an evil deceiver, an evil demon is tricking me into thinking this, is messing with my brain and giving me this hallucination. Anyway, there are lots of possible explanations. So I could doubt that that's true. But can I doubt that I exist? Can I doubt that I think? Descartes says no. So he would say that sort of thing, I think, I am. Those are things that are, now, are they universal? Well, every time they're thought or uttered, they're true. On the other hand, I am, is that really universally true? Is it necessary that I am? No, I mean, once I'm here and I say I am, it's got to be true. On the other hand, it's not a necessary truth that Dan Bonavac exists. I mean, I could easily not have existed. My parents had not met. Actually, if my father had not gotten a furlough and gone to St. Louis for the weekend, gosh, I wouldn't exist. And so there are truths. I'd better edit that out of the video. But anyway, yeah, so that's something that is not quite the same as a scientific law. Nevertheless, it shares many of the same properties. Anytime you think or you utter, I exist, or I think, you're right. Are there other candidates? Yeah?
A equals A.
A equals A, good, the law of identity. Everything is what it is and not another thing, as Bishop Butler put it. That seems like something that is a basic truth of logic, and so something that seems to be absolute, independent of any individual mind, and thus universal. So logic in general is going to look like that. Other things, yeah?
Laws of evolution, maybe?
Of evolution? Yeah, that might be true. So a principle of natural selection or something like that could have this status. It could have a scientific character that would make it universally applicable and absolute. Other things? Yeah?
Gravity.
Gravity, good. The law of gravitation is an example of that. I gave you the Newtonian version. The relativistic version is somewhat more complicated. But whatever the actual true law of gravitation is, it would be like this, yes. Other examples? Mathematics, maybe? Yeah.
Light.
Ah, yes, good. The laws of light. The speed of light, for example, being 380,000, whatever it is. Yeah, I forget now. Rats. I'll have to edit this out too. But yes, the speed of light, whatever it is, that's something that would have this universal character. And in fact, a nice way of thinking about this is that in Einstein's theory of relativity, what are the things that are absolute, independent of any individual reference frame? Those are the laws of nature. And so, although he called it the theory of relativity, actually the laws emerge as the things that are not relative. The length of an object, that's dependent on your reference frame. But the laws of nature, those hold across all reference frames. The second principle is a principle of knowledge. It is possible to have objective knowledge of at least some of these truths. So there are absolute truths that are independent of us and are universally applicable, and it's possible to know what some of them are. So here, for example, is Newton. The mathematical principles of nature. Okay? That's something that he takes to be outlining things that are these truths, and he's showing you why they have to be true. He gives you proofs, he gives you demonstrations, he solves problems. He is showing you that it is possible to have objective knowledge of some of them. And that's something that people took the scientific revolution to have established. A third principle is a principle of reason. How do you do it? How do you actually gain objective knowledge of these absolute truths? Answer is, reason is the best way to achieve and justify such knowledge. Use reason to figure these things out. Sometimes that reason will be something that operates necessarily through reflection, as with the I think, I am, or as with the principles of mathematics. Sometimes it involves careful observation of the world, as with the motions of the heavenly bodies, or the laws governing motion, projectiles, falling objects, and the like. But in any case, you use reason to do this. Now, is reason the only way? Maybe not. Maybe some people can simply intuit truths. There might be some truths that are really introspective truths, like the I think or I am. But nevertheless, the best way to achieve this is through the use of reason. And finally, a principle of progress. There is a bathing beauty showing off a brand new fire engine. Okay? Acting rationally in response to objective knowledge improves our chances of achieving our aims. If we actually gain knowledge through the use of reason of these universal truths, that is something that will enable us to apply our knowledge to develop new technologies, to in general improve human life. And throughout the early stages of the scientific revolution, this was really primarily a matter of faith. It wasn't clear what knowing the law of gravitation was going to do for anyone. However, as time went on, and certainly within 100 years of the revolution, people began recognizing that actually you can use this knowledge that Newton and Galileo and others provided to actually do things, to accomplish things, to develop new technologies, machines, to make possible fire engines and factories and all sorts of other technologies that, as we'll see, played an increasing role in the 20th century. Well, we already mentioned the theory of evolution as a later version of this, as it were a second scientific revolution that brought some of the methods of the other sciences to biology. That was something that developed as, you might say, well, we think of it as Darwin's development. Actually, several people were in a close race to publish this. And so it was an idea that was common at the time. But in any case, the theory was that random mutations together with natural selection can explain the transformation of species, and also, as the title of the book suggests, the origin of species. Now, the theory of evolution is in some quarters today controversial. It's really not because of the transformation of species part, which is not very controversial. It's because of the origin of species part, which is not something easily observed. So that's something that is, you might say, beyond ordinary observations, though people use the fossil record in other ways of trying to determine that. In any event, all of these views, and by those views I mean materialism in its various forms as it emerges from the scientific revolution, evolutionary theory, and then a number of subsequent theories that we look at, are two-level theories. There is a surface conscious level. There is also an underlying explanatory level. And they do change our concept of what it is to be human. They suddenly make us think of ourselves as a mass of molecules moving according to scientific law, or as a biological being driven by certain kinds of biological imperatives. We normally, these things suggest, are not aware of the ultimate explanations of our behavior. Why are you in this room right now? You might think, well, because I'm taking your class, and the class is scheduled for this time in this room, so I'm supposed to be here, right? But notice, that is something that physics doesn't, I mean, you talked about supposed to be here, is that a term of physics? No. Well, you signed up for this class, is signing up a term of physics? No. And so this suggests ultimately the explanation actually isn't, it doesn't involve reasons of that kind, it doesn't involve what you're supposed to be or what you ought to be doing. It's a question of the biochemistry of your brain, let's say, and the way in which it interacts with the rest of the world. So we might picture two-level theories in this sort of way. There's a surface level to be explained. There's a hidden deep level, which is supposed to be doing the explaining of things at the surface level. And the real question is, how do we fit ourselves into that kind of diagram? Okay, yeah. Let's take a look at somebody who stresses the gap between is and ought, who really first notices what I'm calling the problem of normativity, David Hume. And this is his great work, The Treatise of Human Nature, where he talks about the problems that we're going to be discussing. It was something he published when he was only 23. It didn't make much of a splash. He later said it fell stillborn from the press. He was disappointed, and so he wrote a condensed version called The Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding that actually did a much better job of attracting attention to this. Hume was an atheist, and that prevented him from getting a university position. Nevertheless, he was a great writer and supported himself throughout his life by writing. When he turned his attention to ethics, he ended up concluding that ethics was something that was really outside the bounds of science, but also outside the bounds of reason altogether. And here's his argument, in a nutshell. Morals have an influence on the actions and affections. Affections, in other words, are feelings. When I say that murder is wrong, for example, one hopes that influences my actions so I don't do it, and also influences the way I feel. Makes me treat murder with repugnance, makes me shy away from it, makes me deplore it. Reason alone, he says, can have no such influence. Can reason all by itself make me act? Can reason by itself produce certain feelings in me? Now, according to a traditional conception, the answer is, well, yes. But Hume denies it. What I'm doing when I reason is drawing a conclusion from other things. I'm simply going logically. I'm saying this, therefore this, therefore this, therefore this. And nothing about that generates feelings. Nothing about that generates actions, he says. So morality is not a conclusion of reason. It consists of no matter of fact. One way of thinking about this is to say, well, look, science tells us what's involved in the world. We use reason on the basis of science. What do? We go from certain propositions known or believed to be true to other propositions that we then take to be true. Or we are reasoning hypothetically. We say, what if this? And then we suppose that, and on that supposition we derive certain conclusions. Nothing about that actually suggests anything about what we ought to do. None of that involves an action. It's just propositions going on in a head. And that is something that, he says, doesn't have any influence on morality or action at all. So he says, in every system of... Hume was Scottish, so I feel as though I should really do this in his accent. In every system of morality I've met with, I've noticed that the author proceeds for some time reasoning in the ordinary way to establish the existence of a God or making points about human affairs. And then he suddenly surprises me by moving from propositions with the usual copula, is or is not, to ones that are connected but ought or ought not. When I was young, I had a pastor who was from Glasgow, and so I heard him every Sunday. So, how are you doing? Well, anyway. Yeah, is that intelligible? I mean, can you understand me? I enjoy doing that, but sometimes I get the impression he's like, oh, he's like a Scotsman, and nobody can understand a word I'm saying.
We can understand that.
You can understand it? Good. Okay. Yeah, when we get to other thinkers of German, I will... I don't know how far I'll take this. Anyway. Yeah, well, he goes on. It seems like a very small change, but it's highly important. For as this ought or ought not expresses some new relation or affirmation, it needs to be pointed out and explained. And a reason should be given for how this new relation can be, inconceivably, a deduction from others that are entirely different from it. So you go from, now back to my point. So you go from an is, I say, look, this is like that, this is like that. And then I say, so you shouldn't do it. Wait, how do I get there, right? I say, all right, I know you're angry at your roommate. You're thinking that you would like to put rat poison on the doorknob, okay? Sometime when he's there and you're not. However, I say, you know what that will do? That's very bad. It will, cause him harm. It will make him very sick. He might even die. Besides, that rat poison is going to end up who knows where. What if somebody else comes in and they're the first one to touch the knob? Then they will die and so on. And so I can say all these facts. But then you might sit there and say, so what? Right? And that's Hume's worry. So what? You've given me a description of things. Yes, he will get sick. He will either go into seizures. So what? At some point, you've got to say, so don't do it, right? So it's bad. You've got to go from there to the ought or ought not, to the evaluation, to the action, or in this case, the avoidance of action. And yeah, what from the purely is statements gets you there? Now, it's not that there's no way to get there, but Hume says reason will not do it. Reason can't get you there. Moral reasoning, or what's called reasoning, goes from is and is not to ought and ought not, but there's no way to get there in terms of reason itself. So how do we go from is and is not to ought and ought not? Reason supplies no connection. And indeed, if we think about that case, look, here's what would happen. Here is what the effects of that would be. I give you a description. Then you're supposed to say, oh, that would be terrible, okay, and not do it. What takes you from the description to the evaluation?
Experience.
Experience? Well, I hope you haven't had much experience with poisoning your roommates. So at least it's not your experience. On the other hand, that just gets you to more description, right? This is what happens on the basis of experience. Well, if you say, so what? Is it experience that really replies? Yeah.
Ethics, maybe?
Well, good. Ethics does that. That's the point of ethics. On the other hand, he's worried that what's taking us there isn't something rational. It isn't reason that's getting us there. So you're right. Ethics is doing it. But what is ethics like? What is ethics based on? Yeah.
I know how it says reasoning, it has nothing to do with it. You can't make a decision from that. But if you have intelligence, you can't do that. You don't have to have feeling from it. Like you can just say, this is the smart thing to do. I have no feelings towards it.
Oh, good. Okay, the smart thing to do. Good. There are basically two ways of going once he's taken you this far. One way is to say what she just said. Look, I'm a smart person. I can see what the smart thing to do is or is not on the basis of this information you've given me. In other words, she says, look, at a certain point, an action becomes irrational. And so that would be one way to do this. That's the way that Locke or Kant or a variety of other Enlightenment thinkers would approach this. They would say, hold on a second. Admittedly, it's not just reason in the sense of drawing conclusions. It's reason in the sense of what it is rational or irrational for me to do. And so they would think rationality supplies the right kind of connection. Hume doesn't see how it can, and so he's looking for something else. Yeah?
The basic thing is that as fear causes morality, because what's to stop me from me causing him pain? If we didn't have a moral system, I could punch him, no one would care, but you say I ought not do that, and that's because society as a whole has the fear that if we allow things like this to occur, that'll become the norm. So we want to encourage morality such that we won't be randomly punched in the face.
Ooh, okay, yeah, now, his thought is it's fear, okay? Fear in this case of consequences, maybe. Fear that it might not work and that he might poison me. Fear of all sorts of bad effects, right, of this. And so, indeed, that's one way we could look at it. We could say it's not a question of rationality so much, or maybe it's rationality connected to fear. But now, yes.
And what is fear? Fear is an emotion, fear is a passion, fear is... So all this rationality and morality that we've created stems from whether we feel good about doing something or we feel uneasy about doing something, so it's emotions.
Good, that's exactly what Hume says. It's ultimately emotion. Emotions like fear, but also approval or disapproval. I think about those consequences, and maybe I'm afraid of getting caught, but maybe I just think about my roommate. They're lying, and I think, oh man, he borrowed my favorite shirt, but I don't really want him kicking and dying on the floor, okay? And so you might think in those terms and say, well, all right, yes, it's emotion, feeling of some kind. Might be fear, might be some other kind of emotion. That, in the end, is Hume's answer. He says, why is cruelty wrong? Why is generosity good? The answer is not to be found in facts of the matter. There's no fact of the matter to be found in them. He says, 'tis the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself and not in the object. Okay, I have this feeling of fear or disapproval or affection or approval or something. It is a sentiment, it's a feeling that takes us from is to ought. I describe the way things are and I get an emotional reaction to that. Yeah?
Where does Hume get the idea of sentiment if he's a materialist?
Yeah, good question. So what are these feelings? What are these sentiments? They're part of our mental life, right? Hume is interesting in this respect because he's not a materialist. In fact, he thinks, what is it that I know? What is it that is really ultimately before the mind? My own thoughts, my own sensations, my own feelings. And so actually he thinks that what is inside the head is what we really know. And does the material world even exist? Hume thinks, yeah, I don't actually know how to understand that question. So Hume starts from inside the head. So in that respect, he's in some ways philosophically the opposite of people like Diderot and D'Holbach. In fact, at one point he describes himself as trying to be the Newton of the mind, trying to give you the psychological laws that govern the way we think and behave. And so in that respect, he isn't buying into the materialism at all. He starts from a mental place, and in some sense is the first psychologist. Now, here's his famous line. Reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Okay? It's only the passions, only feelings that can tell us ultimately what's right or wrong, what we ought to do and what we ought not to do. And so he ends up saying, an action or sentiment or character is virtuous or vicious. Why? Because its view causes a pleasure or an uneasiness of a particular kind. So in the end, we have a sort of moral sense, a moral sense that is involved with our feelings. We react to the world. Yes, we describe the world in terms of reason, but we also have, as it were, built in, as the kinds of creatures we are, we have certain kinds of reactions. We think about suffering and we recoil from it. After all, I can describe pain or I can describe pleasure, but that's not, in some sense, the full thing, right? I need to know about pain. Ow! I want to avoid it. Pleasure. Ooh, good. I want to seek that. And that's something that doesn't come from reason alone. That comes from feeling. That comes from emotion or sentiment. Well, I'm going to skip a couple of things here and get to a 20th century version of this that generalizes the picture we're talking about. It gives us some key terms we're going to use throughout the course. This is a contemporary, well, almost contemporary, 20th century philosopher, Wilfrid Sellars, who taught at Iowa, at Minnesota, at Yale, and then for about the last 2/3 of his career at the University of Pittsburgh. And he gives a very famous definition of philosophy. The aim of philosophy, abstractly formulated, he says, is to understand how things, in the broadest possible sense of the term, hang together, in the broadest possible sense of the term. Okay, so what is philosophy? It's really the attempt to say how everything fits together, how things hang together. Now, what kinds of things? Well, anything, okay? All of this is understood very, very broadly. It doesn't have one specific field of study. In fact, when I told my grandmother that I was going back to my hometown to study philosophy, she said, "Oh, that's nice, Danny. What's philosophy?" And I said, I hadn't started studying with Sellars yet, so I couldn't give her that. I don't think it would have helped anyway. But it is puzzling, right? If I say, what is astronomy? You know, right? Study of the heavenly bodies. If I say, what is sociology? You know, it's the study of society. Biology, the study of life. But philosophy, ooh, that's hard to say. And here's his point, really. We don't have, as philosophers, a special subject matter. Our job is to explain how all the rest of it fits together. So there's an additional problem, not just how the whole picture fits together. He says the philosopher is confronted not by one complex, many-dimensional picture, like all of those given by the special sciences, the unity of which, such as it is, he must come to appreciate, but by two pictures of essentially the same order of complexity, each of which purports to be a complete picture of man and the world, and which after separate scrutiny he must fuse into one vision. Let me refer to these two perspectives as the manifest and scientific images of the world. So those are the two key terms we're going to be using throughout the course. The manifest image. That is the world as we ordinarily perceive it. And also ourselves as we ordinarily perceive ourselves. And then the scientific image of the world, the image given to us by the sciences, and especially ultimately by physics. How do we fit those two perspectives together? He says it's really a task of stereoscopic vision. We've got one view, that is the view on the basis of common sense, roughly, on the basis of our ordinary perception of the world. And then we've got a view supplied by the special sciences. And as we'll see, especially by the sciences that take us beyond the macro level of observations of the world to the micro level and postulate laws at some microscopic level. How do we fit these two visions of the universe together? What is the manifest image? Well, it's just basically, as he says, characterizable in two ways. First of all, it's the framework in which we encounter ourselves, in terms of which man came to be aware of himself as man in the world. It's the framework in terms of which, to use an existentialist term of phrase, man first encountered himself, which is when he came to be man. And so, basically, this is, well, how you find yourself. What are the basic objects of the manifest image? Well, people, animals, lower forms of life, and merely material things like rivers and stones, cabbages and kings. Okay, the objects of the ordinary world. Like my cow. That's partly a memorial. She died on Monday, so I'm so sad. Yeah, that's pretty sad. But I thought that would bum you out, so I decided to cheer you up with the next slide. Anyway, the other image is the scientific image. It arises out of the manifest image by careful observation and experimentation. Those observatories were there partly to convert our manifest image, common sense observations of the heavens, into a scientific theory. And so we carefully observe, we carefully measure, we test hypotheses, we experiment. But he says then something new happens. Something dramatic happens with the introduction of theoretical entities. Things like atoms, microparticles, genes, all of those sorts of things, fields, all of those are unobservable, but nevertheless causally active. All of the first part, you might say, most of astronomy and so on, is really a matter, at least in the early stages, of refining our manifest image observation of the world. But then we actually introduce that second hidden level, and that changes things dramatically. So the manifest image is our macro level image of the world. The scientific image is our micro level image of the world. What physics ultimately describes as this world of microparticles, waves, fields, and other things that are interacting according to scientific laws at the base level. So here's one way of thinking about this as we now turn our attention back to ourselves. In the manifest image, we talk about rationality. We think of ourselves as behaving as rational people, as making decisions for reasons. We think morality applies to us. Sometimes we make the right decision, sometimes the wrong one. It might really be a moral thing. It might be a different kind of normative thing. There are times when I do something that's not immoral, but just stupid. And so there are all sorts of evaluations there, not just moral evaluations. In that image, we take responsibility, or fail to take responsibility for our actions. We think of ourselves as free. We think of ourselves as capable of making decisions. And so we think of ourselves as exercising what philosophers have called practical reason. But in the scientific image, it looks like I'm simply this congeries, this cloud of microparticles, of waves, of fields that are governed by causal laws. That description of me is completely value-free, and I seem to behave in a way that's purely determined. Or if you think quantum mechanics is to be understood in indeterministic, probabilistic ways, then there's some element of randomness thrown in too. But randomness, plus some degree of determination by law, don't really feel like they add up to freedom. So, well, I'm going to skip this part since we're low on time. But the idea is these images aren't just two rival images, they clash. They differ in certain ways. What makes it tough is that the scientific image seems to claim to be a complete description of the world. And yet, if we think of it as a complete description, we're left out of it. We, as we think of ourselves, we as free beings, as beings at least who think of ourselves as free, who think of ourselves as acting according to reasons, as thinking of ourselves as doing what we ought to do or failing to do what we ought to do, all of that seems left out of the picture altogether. So it looks as if there's really a clash. And the problem is how we fit them together. How do we evaluate the conflicting claims of the manifest image and the scientific image? Well, that is indeed the problem. And Sellars identifies the core of the manifest image. What is really special about it? What is unique? What makes it itself? Well, when he says, when we say that a certain person desired to do A, thought it his duty to do B, but was forced to do C, we're not describing him as a scientific specimen. We're describing him but doing something more. And that's the irreducible core of the manifest image. It is, in our terms, normativity. The irreducibility of the personal is the irreducibility of the ought to the is. So in the end, he says it's really Hume's problem that is dividing these. The manifest image is shot through and through with the ought, with norms of a variety of kinds, with evaluations. But the scientific image seems to be strictly in terms of the is. How do we fit them together? He says, really, in the end, science is describing the realm of law. The manifest image, we think of ourselves as belonging to the space of reasons. But now, how do we combine a view of law with a view of reasons? How do we think of the realm of law as interacting with the space of reasons? He says it's not really a different realm, it's a different way of seeing the same realm. But how do those ways actually combine into one vision of what a human being is? So, here to just summarize, in the manifest image, we think of ourselves as free, acting for reasons, acting rightly or wrongly. We take responsibility. In the scientific image, we're just determined by something we aren't conscious of. Our reasons are mere rationalizations. Morality is either nonsense or it reduces to something else, and so we have no responsibility. And so I'll leave you with this problem. This is a statue called Molecule Men in Berlin, and it seems to me to illustrate this. These beings are striving, they're doing things, it seems, and yet you get the impression they're just made out of steel, they're just made out of microparticles. And so how do we fit those two visions of ourselves together? Well, that's the big theme for the course. So next week we'll start looking at the 19th century background and see how people got to the beginning of the 20th.